This is James Reynolds with BBC World News. Let's go live to the Israeli Parliament, the Knesset in Jerusalem, where a roll call vote is taking place. There you can see it, to elect a new government. That roll call vote began 2 or 3 minutes ago. It is going at a fair clip. At the moment, the Knesset is having to decide whether or not to endorse the government to be led by Naftali, Bennett and Yair Lapid. If endorsed, if this roll call hits 61 votes, which it is expected to, then Naftali Bennett will become the new Prime Minister of Israel, supported by Yair Lapid. They are both former ministers. And significantly, there you can see Naftali Bennett himself on the right, expecting his election as Israeli Prime Minister. Significantly, if this vote hits 61, which was a simple majority, then Mr. Netanyahu, you can see there, who has governed Israel for the last 12 years consecutively and 3 years before that, would once again have to step down from office as he did in 1999, bringing to an end a significant era in Israeli politics. So far, from the information we're getting, as we follow the votes in the Knesset, the vote is going according to schedule. And to explain, there are 120 members of the Knesset. Israel's had 4 votes, 4 elections in the past 2 years. And now, after Mr. Netanyahu clinging on for the last 2 years, a coalition of 8 parties believes that it has the numbers, you can see Mr. Bennett there, to take power from Mr. Netanyahu. And that's significant, as you can see the figure walking down the corridor there, looking reasonably relaxed, is Yair Lapid, a former television talk show host, and look at that embrace. I think that tells you what you need to know about the moments that here. Mr. Lapid is a former talk show host, a former journalist, as the camera follows him around the Knesset, clearly taking in the congratulations of others, because he is the man who has put together this coalition of 8 parties from the left wing, including an Israeli Arab party, which will depose Benjamin Netanyahu on the left there, who will have to become once again the opposition leader of Israel. For many Israelis watching these pictures live from the Knesset, this will be a significant moment. Many people who are 30 or so have only known Benjamin Netanyahu as their prime minister, and certainly over the last 25 years, he has dominated Israeli politics. Indeed, the imprint of his centre-right nationalist policies is still on Israel itself. And you could say that even if Netanyahu himself is defeated, Netanyahuism, the idea of a centre-right coalition in Israel, continues. Naftali Bennett, who you just saw there, the camera switched to him, is a former aide to Mr. Netanyahu, but they broke several years ago. Naftali Bennett, who is 49 years old, only controls 6-7 seats in the Knesset as these votes are being tallied. And Naftali Bennett there, and there you can see Yair Lapid, his partner in this coalition, standing with his right hand on the Knesset seats. They look close now to taking power. If they do get this 61 seats, and we will be tallying these and having a look at this vote, then they will essentially be sworn in to their government with those 8 parties. RAM, the Arab bloc, 4 members of the Knesset that would bring. The first time an independent Arab party comes into government. Then you have a left-wing bloc of Meretz, 6 seats. Labour, which dominated Israel for its founding 3 decades, comes in with 7 seats. Then you have Yair Lapid's party, as he is there in the centre of the screen embracing. He brings 17 seats. Then you have the centre-right bloc of former allies of Benjamin Netanyahu, who got fed up with him. They bring 27 seats, and they will want a continuation of centre-right policies. And then you have Mr. Bennett himself, who only controls a very small number of seats. And this really was the idea of Yair Lapid, who thought that the only way to try to get to 61 was to put together as many seats as possible and to give way on the idea of being Prime Minister himself imminently. And the idea, as you can see the new speaker there, Miki Levy from Mr. Lapid's party, counting up the votes, and once we get confirmation of what's happened, we will bring this to you. Counting up the votes, and essentially, listen to the applause.
אני מבקש, חברים, בבקשה.
Friends, please, Mickey Levy says in Hebrew. Friends, please, as he tries to calm things. But the embraces that you can see, and the allies surrounding Naftali Bennett there, sitting down, gives you an indication of how the vote has come. Just looking on our screen of information, new Israeli government set to unseat Netanyahu, wins majority in parliament vote. That is according to the Reuters news agency, and that has just flashed up in the last few seconds or so. Let's look at some street scenes in Israel. It's difficult to tell where this is. Having lived in Jerusalem for 5 years, I would guess that this is in Jerusalem itself, in western Jerusalem, potentially close to the Prime Minister's residence itself. It is interesting to note that Naftali Bennett, who is a multi-millionaire, is not planning to move into the Prime Minister's residence, which is deep in the heart of West Jerusalem. And so it may be some time before Benjamin Netanyahu himself moves out. One report I read suggested that the new government, when sworn in, will say that Mr. Netanyahu's government cleaning services will end immediately. There is Mr. Netanyahu. This vote, if those tallies are correct, and those scenes in the parliament are confirmed as they are, that Mr. Netanyahu leaves that seat as Prime Minister after 12 consecutive years in power as Israel's leader. 3 years before that, he is the longest serving Israeli Prime Minister since the country declared independence in 1948, beating David Ben-Gurion and many other famous Prime Ministers. But he now faces an uncertain time. It is worth us saying that his corruption trial, he is on trial for corruption, continues. He pleads innocent, not guilty to those charges, but he will now have to defend himself imminently as an ex-Prime Minister. There's also another threat he faces as he starts to exit the screen and indeed exit the Knesset there. That the new incoming government is suggesting that Prime Ministers should have a total of 8 years or so in office. Mr. Netanyahu, with his 15, may then be disqualified if that new government can get that law through. So Mr. Netanyahu, despite the fact that his centre-right policies are still popular in Israel, faces an uncertain time. The very fact, at the moment I should say, that the camera continues to focus on him. And there, did you see that? That half-second handshake between Mr. Netanyahu and Mr. Bennett. That might be the picture of the day in Israel. The two men know each other very well. They come from extremely similar backgrounds. Both had families who spent many years in America. Both have strong ties to the United States. Both served in special forces units when they were in the Israeli armed forces. Mr. Bennett worked for Mr. Netanyahu when he was leader of the opposition more than 12 years ago, but has now defected. And Mr. Netanyahu there, I think, now realizes the scale of his defeat. It is worth saying that during Parliament earlier today, he has not admitted that he is entirely losing. He told the Parliament, if we are destined to go into opposition, we will do so with our heads held high until we can overthrow it. You can see too to his left Yuval Steinitz, an Israeli member of the Knesset I've spoken to many times, as Mr. Netanyahu shook hands there with Yair Lapid, who is a former finance minister. It is interesting to note here that that conversation with Yair Lapid, the man who has organized Mr. Netanyahu's overthrow, is a lot longer than it was with Mr. Bennett. So the two men, these two, know each other very well. Yair Lapid, having been a talk show host for many years when Mr. Netanyahu was a politician, moved into government himself, became the finance minister, worked with Mr. Netanyahu, but always ultimately with that aim of doing what he has done in the last few minutes, which is unseating Mr. Netanyahu. It is worth saying that these 8 parties in this coalition have very little in common in their beliefs, apart from one guiding operational belief, which is bringing down Mr. Netanyahu. There are 5 building blocks in Israeli society. There is the Israeli Arab bloc, which makes up about 20% of the population. There is the left-wing bloc, which for years believed in a two-state solution and in negotiating with Palestinians. There is the
Our World continues next week here on BBC
World
World
to rule over the Palestinians, doesn't much want to negotiate with them either. There is the right-wing nationalist bloc, controlled for so many years by Mr. Netanyahu, and then there is the ultra-Orthodox bloc.